Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel. Time for Album versus Album Part 3. I'll be choosing between classic rock and metal albums as nominated by you guys. Gonna get things started here with Metallica and the Black Album versus Megadeth and Countdown to Extinction. And I love this matchup because a lot of people who hate the direction that Metallica took on the Black Album love Countdown to Extinction, despite the fact that they're basically the same records from a songwriting standpoint. Both records are commercial, which, isn't a bad thing. A lot of people think commercialism is a bad thing. Not necessarily. With a few exceptions, many prominent thrash bands took steps to commercialize in the early 90s. Metallica were just the most successful, but it doesn't mean that they were the only ones to do it. Countdown to Extinction is significantly more accessible than its predecessor, Rust in Peace, and it's still a great album, though, even though, both the Black Album and Countdown are more radio-friendly. Now, both of these records yielded some of the band's biggest hits, of course, respectively, you have Enter Sandman and Symphony of Destruction, but I might be tired of the Black Album at this point. I've heard all those songs on the radio to death, but you can't deny it's a very consistent, meticulously made record. There's a lot of really, strong tracks on here, songs that have the longevity to be played live, for their entire careers, things of that nature. Very consistent album, and, it really set the standard for other thrash bands commercializing, over the next few years. I gravitate towards the deeper cuts on this record at this point, songs like Holier Than Thou, Don't Treat on Me, Through the Never, which is very, Injustice for All-esque, I would say. Of Wolf and Man, The God That Failed is my favorite song on this album, My Friend of Misery and The Struggle Within, and then, you have, of course, Countdown to Extinction. Now, this record, again, I consider it to be very similar to the Black Album. I kind of think these two albums go hand in hand, and there's always that never-ending Metallica versus Megadeth debate, which I think is stupid. They're two great bands, but you can't deny the parallels between the two records. I think the deeper cuts on the Black Album really make that record for me. As for which one is stronger, it's very close. However, I just have more fun listening to Countdown to Extinction, so I'm going to give that the edge here today. So, Countdown over the Black Album, but it's very close. I just love deep cuts on here, like, This Was My Life, High Speed Dirt, Psychotron, Captive Honor, Ashes in Your Mouth, in addition, of course, to some of the better-known tracks on here, like Skin of My Teeth, of course, Symphony of Destruction, like I mentioned, probably the band's best-known song, Architecture of Aggression, Foreclosure of a Dream. Sweating Bullets is interesting because I don't like the song lyrically, but musically, it's a really well-put-together song. I think they use some really great solos on a goofy track, kind of a throwaway song, but it's become, one of their better-known tracks. And the title track, very underrated stuff on this album, so for me, it's a great record, and I just slightly prefer it over the Black Album. How about a little bit of Rush here? Next up, we have Hemispheres versus A Farewell to Kings. It almost feels like heresy to choose between one of these albums because, they really go hand in hand for me, right? I mean, I can't start listening to A Farewell to Kings and then not finish it up with, listening to Hemispheres and Cygnus Book 2. I just can't, right? I have to. Both records have excellent songwriting by Neil Peart, and the instrumentation by the band is phenomenal. This is Rush, in their prime here. Standouts on A Farewell to Kings for me include, of course, the title track, Xanadu, Closer to the Heart, Cinderella Man, and Cygnus Part 1, which of course would lead to the entirety of Side 1 on Hemispheres, kind of the crux of that entire Side 1 being Cygnus Book 2, and just the creativity to do that is phenomenal to me, right? I mean, Cygnus Part 1 is insane, and the record is so explosive, and then that carries over onto Hemispheres. I love how proggy and creative both albums are, but I just think Hemispheres is a bit stronger, and it's really tough, even though both albums are full of classics, and again, these two kind of go hand in hand for me. Standouts on Hemispheres, like Cygnus Book 2, Circumstances, great deep cut, the trees, and the instrumental La Via Strangiato, just kind of put it over the edge for me. I'm going to stick with prog here with Pink Floyd, go with Wish You Were Here versus Animals, two great records from the big four of their catalog, and this is a super tough one because both albums are, very different records. Animals tells a tighter story with really effective lyrics and excellent instrumentation, to back it up with great proggy pieces on here, like Dogs, Pigs, three different ones, Sheep as well. And then on the other hand, you have Wish You Were Here, which is more introspective from a lyrical standpoint, a tribute to Syd Barrett as well, and a record packed with emotion, It's the perfect Pink Floyd album, in my opinion, and like Animals, right, not a lot of tracks, but rather they emphasize quality over quantity. There's no skips, no filler on here, and ultimately, Wish You Were Here is my favorite Pink Floyd record with standouts like, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Welcome to the Machine, Have a Cigar, and the title track, which is just fantastic, right? So I might be a bit biased on this one. Animals, though, is really where Roger started to take the band over more and more here, so Wish You Were Here feels like the last, fully collaborative effort by Pink Floyd and that classic lineup, if that makes any sense. And so that said, this one is so close, though, that it can really be decided by the flip of a coin, and I'd be good either way. But speaking about personal favorites, Wish You Were Here just kind of takes it for me. I really like this matchup here. It's progressive metal versus power metal, Dream Theater versus Blind Guardian. Two awesome concept albums here as well. Nightfall in Middle Earth is, very over the top, almost a bit theatrical. It's super grandiose, and there's so much variety on that record too, with the use of flutes, violins, folk instruments, and more, on top of the band's fast-paced and melodic guitar work. And Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory, is, one of Dream Theater's best records. I'd say conceptually it's a stronger album between the two. James LeBrie's delivery is, so great on this album, and the emotions conveyed in his vocals, as well as the playing of John Petrucci, adds so much to the story. It's a record that was influenced by, albums like The Wall, Tommy, Sgt. Pepper, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and more. And Dream Theater are always a band that wore their influences on their sleeve, and, there are so many callbacks here to, classic prog. Some standouts on this record for me include Overture, Strange Deja Vu, Through My Words, Fatal Tragedy, Beyond This Life, Through Her Eyes, Home is great, Dance of Eternity, One Last... the whole album here. The Spirit Carries On is a beautiful track, Finally Free, great 12-minute epic to close things out. Every song on here is a banger. It progresses the story so well, and I really never get tired of hearing it. So, not to say I get tired of hearing, Nightfall in Middle Earth either. I just gravitate more towards the songwriting of Portnoy and Petrucci on this record. So for me, the winner of this matchup has got to be Dream Theater and Scenes from a Memory. My God, this next one is hard. We have Destroyer versus Rock and Roll Over by Kiss, and there's no doubt when comparing these two albums that, Destroyer is the bigger record, right? It has the bigger sound to it with more memorable tracks, as opposed to Rock and Roll Over, which was, I'd say, the perfect follow-up to the monstrous Destroyer record. And are the deep cuts on Rock and Roll Over stronger than Destroyer? That's the question. Both albums have very high highs, but I'd say Destroyer has lower lows, like Great Expectations and Sweet Pain, which are fine tracks, but weaker, I'd say, compared to the rest of the album. And I think Rock and Roll Over is, a more consistent album from top to bottom compared to Destroyer. Packed with songs that have been, Kiss mainstays in their setlist for years. Tracks like, of course, Detroit Rock City, King of the Nighttime World, God of Thunder. Let's see, Shout It Out Loud, Beth, Do You Love Me? I'd rather listen to the deeper cuts on Rock and Roll Over that I really enjoy, like I Want You, Take Me, right? Ladies Room, Baby Driver, great Peter Criss song there, Mr. Speed, Hard Luck Woman, another great Peter Criss song vocal there, Making Love as well to close things out. And so it's difficult, it's going to change all the time, but I'm just going to pick one real quick here, like ripping off a Band-Aid, because it's really difficult. I would say Destroyer is the more momentous record, but Rock and Roll Over is more fun to listen to with more variety. So that's at least how I feel today. I'm going to go with Rock and Roll over Destroyer, but it's very close. My answer might differ if you ask me again tomorrow. Two perfect albums here with the first two Doors records, right? Self-titled versus Strange Days. And I don't think the Doors made a bad record during the lifetime of Jim Morrison. I'm not a huge fan of the stuff that came after, but during Jim's lifetime, they were one of the most consistent bands in psychedelic rock. Their debut, of course, was groundbreaking, and it's the record that gets all the attention, all the play on, mainstream rock radio, and, probably the one I would choose to introduce somebody to the Doors, right? It's that perfect introductory record, perfect debut, full of essentials like Break On Through to the Other Side, Soul Kitchen, 20th Century Fox, Alabama Song, Light My Fire, End of the Night, The End. My God. Just a stacked debut record here, but then you have Strange Days, their sophomore record, not as celebrated as the debut, but still full of excellent tracks, standouts on here, like the title track, Your Lost Little Girl, love the atmosphere, the uneasy atmosphere of that track, Love Me Two Times, Horse Latitudes is a really interesting spoken track by Jim Morrison, Moonlight Drive, People Are Strange, big radio hit there, My Eyes Have Seen You, great deep cut, I Can't See Your Face in My Mind, and When the Music's Over, which I think is better than The End, even though they're both, two great epics to close out the record. Lyrically, I think Strange Days is a little bit stronger too, maybe an unpopular opinion, but this is my favorite Doors album, so as close as it is, I gotta go with their sophomore record over the debut. Really cool matchup here of two traditional metal acts going hair metal at the times of the mid-80s, and I kind of talked about this more at length in the video I did several weeks ago on the channel of bands who went glam. You know, Ozzy and Priest both straying from their traditional sound here for a more MTV-oriented, radio-friendly approach with Turbo and Ultimate Sin. You know, and these are two really interesting periods in each band's history here, and I'm glad each era didn't last for more than one or two albums, but I do enjoy them for what they are. Do they sound dated? Absolutely. You know, could production be better? Definitely, especially on the Ultimate Sin record. You know, I mean, Jakey Lee does a fantastic job, but his guitar really sounds drowned out. I'd say the production is the album's biggest flaw, and you know, even Ozzy himself has said that the record sounds like it lacks imagination, and he'd like to remix it. You know, but there's some great deep cuts on here, right? Tracks like Secret Loser, Never Know Why, Thank God for the Bomb, Lightning Strikes, right? Killer of Giants, fantastic tracks. So some great deep tracks here, in addition to, you know, the very glammy Shot in the Dark, which is a big hit for Ozzy. Then you have Turbo, which has some great moments too. You know, I mean, the image was bad. I'd say the sound change was unnecessary coming off of Defenders of the Faith, but I still dig songs on here like Turbo Lover, Locked In. Out in the Cold is fantastic. That was a great opener on this tour. Reckless is pretty good. Wild Nights, Hot and Crazy Days is alright. It's I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that track. But that said, you know, Turbo has some lower lows, like Private Property and Parental Guidance, which are just embarrassing pandering to the younger audience. So for that, I'll give the slight advantage to the Ultimate Sin. Well, I saved the most difficult one here for last. Iron Maiden, their first two records, self-titled versus Killers. Maiden are my favorite band of all time, so this was next to impossible. The first two records, recorded with Paul Di'Anno on lead vocals, are essential early 80s new wave of British heavy metal and are stacked, right? I mean, I think Iron Maiden is probably the stronger album if you just look at the track list. Prowler, Remember Tomorrow, Running Free, Phantom of the Opera, Transylvania, Strange World, Charlotte the Harlot, and Iron Maiden, but Killers has the better production, right? Produced by Martin Birch and a darker vibe and atmosphere. You know, it would have been really interesting to hear how the band would have grown and evolved with Paul Di'Anno, how they continued with him after Killers, and, you know, not brought in Bruce Dickinson from Samson, although some might argue that Paul was impeding their growth by that point. But still, his vocals are great on both of these albums, and I think it counteracts Steve Harris's proggy influences in a really cool way, kind of bringing in a bit of a punk vibe too, which is interesting. And I wish the debut had the production of Killers, but I just can't go against it, and absolute classics on their debut. It's the perfect record with slightly higher highs than Killers, in my opinion. So that wraps up Album Wars Part 3, choosing between more album matchups as nominated by you guys. Thank you so much for your picks, for your matchups here, and, you know, I obviously cannot get to everybody yet, but I will plan on doing a Part 4 if it's something you guys want to see. I've done 3 parts now, and so it's a lot of fun, something different, and something interactive, so as long as you guys would be interested in a Part 4, I still have plenty more matchups you guys submitted to choose from, so I thank you for that, and please let me know in the comment section if you'd be interested in a Part 4. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your reactions to my picks as well here, because these were not easy, especially this time around. You know, matchups between Maiden, right, Pink Floyd, The Doors. This was very difficult, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, and turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload, because that Part 4 might be coming sooner rather than later. And until next time, it's the CD Guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.